Hi, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. Happy as always to be back with you. We are continuing to read in our book Farmer Boy by Laura Ingalls Wilder. And I believe that we are on chapter 6. And the name of it is Filling the Ice House. Now this here contraption is ice tongs. Like you have salad tongs that will squeeze and pick up salad. This would do blocks of ice. The weather was so cold that the snow was like sand underfoot. It's a very dry snow because it's so cold. A little water thrown in the air came down as tiny balls of ice. Even on the south side of the house at noon, the snow did not soften. This was perfect weather for cutting ice, because when the blocks were lifted from the pond, no water would drip. It would freeze instantly. The sun was rising, and the eastern slopes of the snowdrifts were rosy in its light when Amanzo snuggled under the fur robes between Father and Royal in the big bobsled, and they set out to the pond on Trout River. The horses trotted briskly, shaking jingles from their bells, their breath steamed from their nostrils, and the bobsled runners squeaked on the hard snow. Now, when they would breathe, sometimes like it happens with us too, it's so cold you can blow, and it'll look like smoke coming out of your mouth. And that's the moisture that's in your breath, and horses have that too. The cold air crinkled inside Amanzo's tingling nose, but every moment the sun shone more brightly, striking tiny glitters of red and green light from the snow, and all through the woods there were sparkles of sharp white lights in icicles. It was a mile to the pond in the woods, and once Father got out to put his hands over the horses' noses, their breaths had frozen over their nostrils, the openings in your nose, making it hard for them to breathe. Father's hand melted the frost, and they went on briskly. French Joe and Lazy John, what a name, were waiting on the pond when the bobsled drove up. They were Frenchmen who lived in little log houses in the woods. They had nicknames. They had no farms. They hunted and trapped and fished. They sang and joked and drank red wine instead of cider. When Father needed a hired man, they worked for him, and he paid them with salt pork from the barrels down in the cellar. Now, when I was young, we used to eat salt pork. It was very salty, but you could cut it and fry that up, and the saltiness was very delicious. But I think lots of times people use that to like flavor their beans. They stood on the snowy pond in their tall boots and their plaid jackets and fur caps with fur earmuffs to keep their ears warm, and the frost of their breaths was on their large mustache frozen. Each had an axe on his shoulder, and they carried long cross saws. A crosscut saw has a long, narrow blade with wooden handles at the ends. The two men must pull it back and forth across the edge of whatever they want to saw into. But they could not saw ice that way, of course, because the ice was solid underfoot, like a floor. It had no edges across. When Father saw them, he laughed and called out, "Hey, you flipped the penny yet?" Everybody laughed but Amanzo. He did not know the joke. So French Joe told him. Once two Irishmen were set out to saw ice with a crosscut saw. They had never sawed ice before. They looked at the ice and they looked at the saw, till at last Pat took a penny out of his pocket, and he says, "Now, Jamie, be fair. Heads or tails, who goes down below?" Then Amanzo laughed. To think of anyone going down in the dark, cold water under the ice to pull one end of the crosscut saw, it was funny that there were people who didn't know how to saw ice. He trudged with the others across the ice to the middle of the pond. A sharp wind blew there, driving wisps of snow before it. Above the deep water, the ice was smooth and dark, swept almost bare of snow. Almanzo watched while Joe and John chopped a big three-cornered hole in it. They lifted out the broken pieces of ice and carried them away, leaving a hole full of open water. "She's about 20 inches thick," Lazy John said. "Then saw 20 inches, said Father. Lazy John and French Joe knelt at the edge of the hole. They lowered their crosscut saws into the water and began to saw. Nobody pulled the ends of the saws that were under the water. Side by side, they sawed 2 straight cracks through the ice, 20 inches apart and 20 feet long. Then, with the axe, John broke the ice across, and a slab 20 inches wide, 20 inches thick, and 20 feet long rose a little and floated free. With a pole, John pulled the slab toward the three-cornered hole. And as the end was thrust out, cracking the thin ice freezing on the water, Joe sawed off 20-inch lengths of it. Father picked up the cubes with the big ice tongs and loaded them on the bobsled. Almanzo ran to the edge of the hole, watching the saw. Suddenly, right at the very edge, he slipped. He felt himself falling into the dark, cold water. His hands couldn't catch hold of anything. He knew he would sink and be drawn under the solid ice. The swift current would pull him under the ice where nobody could find him. He'd drown, head held down by the ice in the dark. French Joe grabbed him just in time. He heard a shout and felt a rough hand jerk him by one leg. He felt a terrific crash, and then he was lying on his stomach on the good solid ice. He got up on his feet. Father was coming running. Father stood over him, big and terrible. "You ought to have the worst whipping of your life," Father said. "Yes, Father," Almanzo whispered. He knew it. He should have been more careful. A 9-year-old boy is too old to do such foolish things because he doesn't stop to think. Almanzo knew that, and he felt ashamed. He shrank up small inside of his clothes, and his legs shivered, afraid of the whipping. Father's whippings hurt, but he knew he deserved to be whipped. The whip was on the bobsled. "I won't thrash you this time," Father decided, "but see that you stay away from the edge." "Yes, Father," Almanzo whispered. He went away from the hole and did not go near it again. Father loaded the bobsled. Then he spread the lap ropes across the top of the ice. So this is how they worked. So here is the one that's cutting them sideways so that you have cubes. And then there's Pa packing it and loading it on the bobsled while the other man continues to cut long lengths. Spread lap robes on top of the ice, and Almanzo rode on them with Father and Royal back to the ice house near the barns. Oh, can you imagine sitting on that frozen ice, even though it had robes over it? The ice house was built of boards with wide cracks between. It was set high from the ground on the wooden blocks and looked like a big cage. Only the floor and the roof were solid. On the floor was a huge mound of sawdust, which Pa had hauled from the lumber mill. With a shovel, Pa spread the sawdust 3 inches thick on the floor. On this he laid the cubes of ice 3 inches apart. You don't want them to touch because as they begin to melt, they would stick. Then he drove back to the pond, and Almanzo went to work with Royal in the ice house. They filled every crack between the cubes with sawdust, and they tamped it down or pushed it down tightly with sticks. Then they shoveled the whole mound of sawdust on top of the ice in a corner, and where they had covered the floor with cubes of ice, and packed that with sawdust. Then they covered it all with sawdust 3 inches thick. I think that 3 inches must be a little longer than my finger. This is probably 2 inches, 2.5. They worked as fast as they could, but before they'd finished, Father came back with another load of ice. He laid down another layer of ice cubes 3 inches apart and drove away, leaving them to fill every crevice tightly with sawdust, and spread sawdust over the top, and shovel the rest of the mound of sawdust up again. They worked so hard that the exercise kept them warm. But long before noon, Almanzo was hungrier than a wolf. He couldn't stop working long enough to run into the house for a donut. All of his middle was hollow, with a gnawing inside. He knelt on the ice, pushing sawdust into the cracks with his mittened hands, and pounding it down with a stick as fast as he could. And he asked Royal, "What would you like best to eat?" They talked about spare ribs and turkey with dressing and baked beans and crackling cornbread and other good things. But Almanzo said that what he would like to eat most in the world was fried apples and onions. Wow, I've never had that. When at last they went to dinner, there on the table was a big dish of them. Mother knew what he liked best, and she cooked it for him. Almanzo ate 4 large helpings of apples and onions fried together. He ate roast beef and brown gravy and mashed potatoes and creamed carrots and boiled turnips and countless slices of buttered bread with crabapple jelly. "Takes a great deal to feed a growing boy," Mother said, and she put a thick slice of bird's nest pudding on his bare plate and handed him a pitcher of sweet cream speckled with nutmeg. Almanzo poured the heavy cream over the apples nested in a fluffy crust. The syrupy brown juice curled up around the edges of the cream. Almanzo took up his spoon and he ate every bit. Then, until short time, he and Royal worked in the ice house. All day they worked, and all the next day. Just as dusk on the 3rd day, Father helped them spread the last layer of sawdust over the topmost edges of the ice in the peak of the ice house roof, and that job was done. Buried in the snow, the blocks of ice would not melt in the hottest summer weather. One at a time they would be dug out, and Mother would make ice cream and lemonade and cold eggnog. Well, I like ice cubes too, but my ice cubes are very small. They go into my glass to make things cold. Sometimes they go in my blender if I'm going to make a smoothie. Well, I hope you enjoyed that one. I did. And it used to be really hard to keep things cold. They had to find ways to do it. They didn't have refrigerators and freezers like we do now. But they were very smart and very wise at making sure and doing what they needed to do. Well, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Give me a thumbs up and a comment on what you think about this story. Or just a comment of where you live would be nice. Well, I hope that you have a good evening. I want to pray blessings on you and yours, in your house and out of your house, in the day and the night. And whatever you do, keep dreaming.